so much for coming out tonight. What a great crowd, and for good reason. I think it's going to be a phenomenal event, and I'm so glad you could all be here. As Alan said, I'm Lissa Muscatine. I'm one of the co-owners of Politics and Prose, along with my husband, Brad Graham, who's lurking around over there somewhere. And on behalf of our incredible staff here, we welcome all of you to tonight's event with Jill Wine-Banks. Many of you, I'm sure, know Jill as an astute and clear-eyed legal analyst on MSNBC, where she spent much of the past 2 years guiding viewers through the nuances of the Mueller investigation and, more recently, the impeachment of Donald Trump. Now we're lucky enough to glean more of her wisdom through her new book. By the way, it's her first book. It's called The Watergate Girl, My Fight for Truth and Justice Against a Criminal President. I think you know which president she's actually talking about, but just as an aside. It's an engaging, entertaining, deeply personal memoir about her path as a trailblazing woman in a legal career spanning 5 decades. Let's just say that The Watergate Girl should be on every American's reading list. For those of us old enough to remember Watergate, some of us, Jill offers inside accounts of events based on her role as a young assistant special prosecutor investigating President Nixon. Included, of course, is Jill's decisive questioning of Rosemary Woods regarding the infamous 18-minute gap on one of those Nixon tapes. Now, those of you too young to know who Rosemary Woods was, or to have come along after Watergate, you also need to read her book. It provides needed historical context to what we've all just experienced in the Donald Trump era, and is a passionate reminder about the importance of the rule of law, the separation of powers, and the corrosive effects of a president who operates without a moral compass and without political guardrails. Jill's experiences in the Watergate investigation alone would make for a page-turner, but she also writes with personal candor and deep insight about the realities for women breaking barriers in male-dominated professions like the law. In addition to her work on Watergate, Jill was an organized crime prosecutor at the Justice Department, the General Counsel of the U.S. Army, a Deputy Attorney General of Illinois, and COO of the American Bar Association. She was the first woman ever to hold any of those positions, all of those positions. In short, she knows what she's talking about, and she has a lot to say. Brad and I are also delighted that our old friend and former colleague Ruth Marcus will be in conversation with Jill this evening. Ruth is a highly respected legal expert herself, one I think many of us routinely turn to for clarity and understanding of the day's events. During her career at the Washington Post, she's put her law degree to good use, covering the Justice Department, the Supreme Court, and the White House. She's currently deputy editorial page editor of the Washington Post and was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for commentary in 2007. Her superb new book, Supreme Ambition, about the Kavanaugh hearings, was published in December. If you have not read it, you must. It's also on various of our staff pick walls and best nonfiction and so on. And you must also, of course, read her weekly column in the Washington Post. We're delighted to have them both here. Please join me in welcoming Jill Wine-Banks and Ruth Marcus.
Hi. Oh, good. Hi, everybody. What a great turnout. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jill, for inviting me to do this.
I'm so honored that you did it.
I'm so tickled because I remember, I don't want to age any of us, but I remember being a high school student watching sorry, I know. It's a really a rare moment. It's a really a rare moment when I get to be the younger person. Oh, just slightly younger. But I think I was trying, as I was reading your book, which is so gripping and so well told and such an interesting life story, I was remembering how vivid you were as a figure. I don't think I had any clue then that I was interested in going to law school or having an interest in legal things, but it was striking to see a woman in your position and the attention that you got. I should start by asking, I think, how you came to write this book, because when you emailed me the other day, you mentioned something I hadn't realized, which is that you had been thinking about writing it or working on it since 2008. So talk a little bit about the decision to launch on a book writing project, which is not necessarily fun.
It actually sort of was fun because you're able to relive your life in a way, and I remembered so much of it so vividly, but anytime I needed to, I have Google now. And of course, that was never part of my life. There was no LexisNexis or Google. But now I was able to really check my memory. And of course, remember, I wanted to be you. My undergraduate degree was in journalism, and I only went to law school because jobs for women, who were called girls, hence the title, The Watergate Girl, were on the woman's page. I don't know how many of you remember that there used to be a woman's page. Tea was served and Mrs. Smith poured. And while that might have been interesting to some, I wanted to do legal or foreign affairs. I wanted to do something really exciting in the real news. So I went to law school to help get to there. But going back to your question about the book, which is I wrote an article right after Watergate. And I had an agent who placed it at a magazine, and I got paid for it, and it was very exciting. And he wanted me to write a book. And I said, I'm way too busy. I don't have time to do it. And so I just didn't do it. And then friends through the years have said, you must write a book. And I kept saying, I don't have time. And then I theoretically retired in 2008. Didn't work out so well, as you can see, but I did theoretically retire. And I retired on a Friday. On Saturday, I flew to Italy to be with friends who were on the Amalfi Coast, and they said, okay, you don't have any more excuses. Your time is now, write a book. I said, well, maybe when I get home. They said, what are you waiting for? I said, well, I don't have a computer with me. They said, here's a pad of paper, start. And I did. I took a legal pad, and I did an outline, and that was in 2008. So that was the start of it. And then I came up with a proposal, and I got an agent, and he thought that the proposal should be more focused on personal. And so he had me write a chapter on personal, and he submitted that. And then the publishers all said, if it was more about Watergate, we'd be interested. She writes well, we like it, but really it's the wrong focus. And he said, they're all wrong. No, don't change it, don't change it. So I kind of gave up. And then when I went on TV, which happened because I wrote an op-ed after taking a course. Anybody who wants to write, you should take this course, Project Op-Ed. It's intended to help get minorities and women onto editorial pages. And so I wrote an op-ed, and it got published. And
Wait, for whom?
For the Chicago Tribune. But it was my hometown paper, and I wrote it, and I just submitted it, and they published it, and the next thing I knew, my phone was ringing. We want you on television to talk about it. And I said, I'm in rural Texas right now, because I flew to rural Texas the day I submitted the op-ed. And they said, well, how about on Monday when you get home? And I said, yes. And so I started doing television, and then I contacted my agent again and said, well, maybe now they'd be more interested. And it just didn't sort of work until I got a contract with NBC, and then the lawyer who did that contract said, I have a much better agent for you. And he introduced me to Flip Brophy at Sterling Lord, who was fabulous, who introduced me to a fabulous, fabulous editor who really got my story and said, it's a combination, he said, of All the President's Men and Hidden Figures. Because it... And when he said that, I went, oh, I really like him. I want to work with him, because I thought he really gets the story, that it was, and by the way, for those of you who follow me, I wear pins every day. And this one is a replacement for my real authentic book tour one, which is a couple with a woman dancing backwards in high heels, which symbolizes all the hurdles that women have to overcome. But I spoke at the Watergate Hotel. They did an event for me yesterday, and they made a pin for me with the Watergate Hotel logo, and it says the Watergate Girl under it. So I had to wear that today.
I wasn't planning to ask this, but since you brought it up, when did the pin thing start?
Actually, if you read the book and look at the pictures, you will note that I'm wearing pins in almost every picture, because I've always worn pins. They were pretty pins. They were just an accessory. I just always liked pins as an accessory. And when I first went on television, I thought, all the guys are wearing American flag pins. That is so boring. And it's so trite.
Plus, you don't have a lapel.
I don't have a lapel necessarily, but I had in my collection of just costume jewelry pins that I've been wearing, I had a great celluloid pin, probably from the 20s. It was an American eagle holding a shield saying, "Defend America." And it's celluloid, it's almost see-through, so I didn't think anyone would notice it, but I thought, to me, that's the message. So I wore that, and sure enough, someone noticed it and tweeted to me saying, "What does it mean? I love your pin, tell me more about it." And then I thought, well, if I can send messages with my pins, I will start doing that. And it has now become an obsession. People send me pins. People give me the most, all the clever pins I have are from someone else. Mine are much more like Defend America. But it's been really fun. And my editor thinks that this is ridiculous, and my agent thinks it's ridiculous. But I have a title for the second book, which is about my pins. But I'm not going to share the title yet.
Wow. All right. Well, prepare to come back here. So I do think if you haven't read the book, which you totally should, it's a really interesting read that combines insights into law and insights into the way women have been treated in the world, and really fascinating exposition of then and now. And I think that your agent's description of it is exactly right. It's All the President's Men meets Hidden Figures. So let's talk about why that's the right description of it. So talk a little bit about why that's the right description of it and the hidden figures part.
Right. Well, the All the President's Men plus one woman was because it obviously is what happens after the Washington Post very successfully revealed what was, to me, from the day that Woodward and Bernstein first reported it. I knew it was not a third-rate burglary as described by Ronald Ziegler, the White House press officer. It just couldn't be. And then, of course, by March of '73, we were appointed in May. By March, the security advisor to CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, but it is known as CREEP, it seems sort of appropriate, had already written a letter to try to get a reduced sentence. It was on the eve of sentencing. He wrote to Judge Sirica and said, "Your Honor, you're right. People lied, perjury was committed, and hush money was paid. We were told to be quiet, and we got paid." So that was a clearer sign that this wasn't nothing. But we still didn't know that it went all the way up to the president. And so when I started in May of '73, we didn't know exactly where we were going, but it was an investigation just continuing on from All the President's Men. And
I'm going to interrupt you because I want you to sort of tell the story of how you got the job and what it was like to come into that office and what you've been doing previously.
Well, I was an organized crime section prosecutor, and I had stood up for myself. I had learned a lesson, which was all lawyers in organized crime start out doing appeals. And a year later, I was still doing appeals, and I realized that the guys I started with were now doing trials, and I had been hired as a trial attorney. So I had no one to talk to. There was one woman in the Department of Justice who was the head of appeals. I don't know if you ever heard of her, B. Rosenberg. She was legendary. But there were no trial lawyers, and there was really no one for me to talk to. And I just thought, well, I have to go to the boss and ask how come. And so I did, and Henry Peterson, who also plays a role in Watergate, so you will see his name as part of the Watergate story, says, well, you're a girl, and you'd be so much more vulnerable. In appeals, it's just the lawyers. In trial, you'd be in the courtroom with made members of the mafia. And I just said, well, Henry, what didn't you notice when you hired me as a trial attorney?
So what year is this?
That was that was in 1969, almost, yeah, at the end of 1969.
And when he says that, you were among a very few number of women in your Columbia Law School
Yes.
class. even fewer of those.
And some of, at least I see one law school classmate here, but it's not of the female gender. Oh, and Greer, is Greer here? Because she's from Harvard, but that's okay. Greer. Okay, so there are some here.
And
Oh,
even
more. Raise your hand.
and
Susan.
even fewer women going into a tough guy field like
Yes.
being federal prosecutors, and even fewer women going into a particularly tough guy field like being organized crime prosecutors. Were you surprised when Henry Peterson said that to you, or did this seem kind of business as usual, normal at the time?
Well, it's not that I was unprepared. When I started law school, and I took a year off, so I actually started with a class of 67, but I took a year off to do journalism. And I was told someone would die in Vietnam because I had taken their rightful place in the class, and they wouldn't get a deferment. When I was interviewing for jobs, I was told that, in one place, we can't possibly hire you because travel is required and everybody else is a man, and we can't possibly let you travel with a man. When I took the bar exam, by the way, it was segregated. I walked into the room, and let me just say, only 4% of all lawyers were women at the time. I walk into the room, and it's only women. And I know that can't be a coincidence, so I asked the proctor, what's going on? And he said, well, it's in a law school and there aren't very many women's room, and we wanted you to be near the women's room so you wouldn't have to waste time during the exam finding the women's room. Now, that sounded almost credible, wrong, but credible. And a woman named Karen DeCrow wrote a book called Sexist Justice and she had graduated a year after me, and she observed the same thing. And when she asked, she was told because it would be too sexually arousing to the men to have women in the room. So that's in her book. Okay. So it's not that I wasn't aware of discrimination. And remember, I was in law school because of discrimination in journalism. And I was inspired by Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, who had written a book called Gideon's Trumpet. And on the back cover, I remembered reading that he had gone to Harvard Law School. And what I didn't realize was that he did it after winning a Pulitzer Prize and on a Nieman Fellowship. But somehow I had translated that knowledge into, well, if it helped him be a good writer, it's going to help me. And maybe an editor will take me seriously. So that was, part of it. And I had one woman role model. I certainly didn't know any women lawyers. But Nancy Dickerson, who was at the time that I met her, was Nancy Haunchman, spoke to the Freshman Honor Society at the University of Illinois. And I just thought, wow, she's really glamorous, and that's a really great thing. But I didn't think anybody could really be a journalist. And I started college as an occupational therapy major, a much more traditional female role. And then I realized I'd have to cut up a cadaver. And so I thought I had to have another career. And I remembered as a grade school student taking a vocational, interest thing that said never, ever do anything that requires detail like filing. You will fail. But it said that I was a good writer. And so I thought, well, okay, then I'll go into journalism. And so I entered the journalism school, and I loved it and wanted to be a writer. And
but Henry Peterson is telling you girls don't do trials.
Right. But then
you had a good comeback for him when you said, what did you think I was when you hired me?
Exactly.
And
thought it was obvious.
So you were doing trials, and you got this opportunity to apply for the Watergate
But let me just say that
course.
my first trial, because it sort of fits in with what you're saying, Chuck Ruff was my direct boss, who is the smartest, best lawyer. He was he was White House counsel during the Clinton impeachment. He was the fourth Watergate special prosecutor, so you probably don't remember him as that. And he had a trial coming up in Alaska right after I had this exchange with Henry Peterson. And so he said, okay, you can come to Alaska with me. And I think they thought, well, it's Alaska, it's far enough away, it can't be so bad. And it was a labor racketeering case, not necessarily really mafia. So I went off to Alaska on January 1st, and the rules then were I could not wear pants. I had to wear a skirt. The jury is wearing mucklucks and flannel-lined pants, and I'm wearing a skirt, walking in 30 degrees below zero through snow, because those were the rules for girl lawyers.
And so tell the story of getting hired. You were on your way to Florida.
Yeah.
For I think
To Williamsburg.
Williamsburg,
I was on
sorry,
Williamsburg.
for a vacation,
Right.
and you go in to interview for this job.
It was Memorial Day weekend, and my parents were visiting from Chicago. We had just bought a house just off Connecticut Avenue, not far from here. And I got a call saying, could you come in tomorrow morning for an interview? And I had been at Justice for almost 5 years, not quite, but almost. And that's a time when you think about, are you going to make it a permanent career or not? If you stay too long, then you don't have so many options. And so changing jobs didn't seem like a bad thing, even though I loved my job and was quite happy there. And so I went in for the interview, and it was Jim Vorenberg, who came with Archie Cox from Harvard, and with Phil Hyman, who was Ruth's first professor at Harvard, her very first class. And he said, when can you start? And I said, well, what do you mean? I'm here. He said, no, I mean, when can you start work? And I went, don't you have any questions? And he said, no, we've done a full check of your background. You've won enough cases. We want you to start. And I said, well, it's going to take me weeks to get rid of my caseload. He said, basically, you're starting tomorrow. And I pretty much started, I was working 2 jobs at first. And I started right away. That was how it all started. And my first day in the office, I met Jeb Magruder, who you will read about in the book. He's a prominent figure. He was one of the 2 major witnesses, John Dean and Jeb Magruder. And I walk into the office. Jim Neal was the senior person. He was 10, 12 years older. Rick Benvenista was a Columbia classmate of mine, but ahead of me. And the 3 of us are going to interview him about a plea deal. But they've determined that he's going to be my witness. And we start the interview, and then Jim says, would you like coffee, to Jeb and his lawyer? And they both turned to me and said, I'll take it black. And good for Jim Neal, he said, not very smart insulting the person who's going to make the decision about your plea deal. And then George Frampton, who unfortunately isn't here tonight, but was going to be, George Frampton, who was also in the room, got up and got the coffee because he was the junior person in the room. So, I mean...
But you have, I mean, I don't want this whole thing to be about sexism,
right.
But it is so extraordinary. It's just so extraordinary because the crap that you had to put up with and that you seem to have remarkable comebacks for on a lot of them. But just tell maybe the moment that was the most... right, just quietly infuriating for you. It might have been maybe when Judge Sirica messed up your interview with a certain very prominent witness.
Yeah, he did it twice, so it's hard to pick which of the 2. But before I answer that, and I will, is I actually think it wasn't until writing this book that I realized how hurt I had been by sexism, how much it influenced me to have less self-confidence, how it kept me in a bad marriage, in part because I was being put down by the world. And I didn't realize it, honestly, but as I started writing an outline, remember I'm back in Italy now, starting this outline, and I'm just writing down stories that I think I will include in a book. And as I look at them, I realize that a lot of them are like the Magruder coffee story. It's really sexism. And so the story that Ruth is talking about, twice during the trial, once during the tapes hearing, I was cross-examining Rosemary Woods, who was now the prime suspect in an obstruction of justice by an erasure of 18 and a half minutes from a key White House tape. And at one point, Judge Sirica, as the tension was building, which is something you sometimes want to do in cross-examination, he said, "Now, ladies, we have enough problem in the courtroom without two women arguing." But that wasn't actually the worst one, because during the trial itself, I was questioning, and by the way, I questioned Rosemary having nothing to do with it being gender-based. A lot of people think that because she was a woman, I was assigned to question her as a woman, and that wasn't true. I was assigned as a woman to question Bob Mardian because he was known as a hothead, mean and evil. John Dean says nobody liked him. He was really horrible.
Remind us of
who
he was.
Mardian was one of the defendants, one of the top people in the creep, and he had been assistant attorney general before that. He argued the Pentagon Papers case. I mean, he was but it was his personality that led to my being assigned, because we thought if I could get him to yell at me, it would really hurt him in front of the jury. If he yelled at Jim or Rick, no one would care. Then we thought, well, male chauvinism was a thing at the time, that maybe he will not yell at me because I'm a woman. He will control himself. And so we thought, well, if he doesn't yell at me, we haven't lost anything, because yelling at Rick or Jim's not going to get anything. But if I can provoke him, and if he will yell at me, it will hurt. And it was simple. It was so easy. He started yelling. And almost immediately, Judge Sirica said, "Mr. Mardian, don't you know you can never win an argument with a lady?" And his lawyer said, "Recess, Your Honor, recess." And every defense lawyer in the courtroom ran up to him and said, "You are killing yourself. The jury hates you. You cannot act this way." So, of course, the point of all this was now I had to just get down to asking questions and getting factual answers. But I had accomplished what the goal was, and he had shown himself to be who he was, and he did get convicted. His lawyer wrote a book in which he says the only reason he got convicted, and there was evidence, this is not true, but he said the reason he got convicted is because he yelled at me. So,
And the judge did end up apologizing.
yes, because for the first and only time in my life, I had support. The students at Columbia Law School wrote to Judge Sirica and said, "This is unacceptable behavior." And he called me into chambers and said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean that to be." And honestly, he didn't like tension in the courtroom, even though as a trial lawyer, we wanted that. But he would have interrupted Richard. He's now Richard. He's an adult, but I still call him Rick.
What was his nickname for you?
Jilly Bean. Daisy Duck. And we're still very good friends. And in fact, is Lulu here? Is his daughter here? Yay. Richard is diving with his wife, but his daughter is here. Anyway, I forgot what I was saying.
He apologized.
So Judge Sirica
Yeah.
called me in, and he did apologize and said, "I didn't mean it in a sexist way." And I believe he would have cut off either Jim Neal or Richard Benveniste in a different way. It wouldn't have been sexist. It would have been something else, but he would have stopped it because he got nervous with that kind of tension.
So just to put a pin in this piece of the conversation, sorry, that was actually more clever than I intended it to be. But yes, thank you. When you look at the treatment of women in the profession and women in society then, and you look at the treatment of women in the profession and women in society now, is the glass half empty or is it half full? No one would speak to a woman lawyer, which is a phrase, or a female lawyer, which is a phrase that annoys both of us, the way judges spoke or lawyers or anybody spoke to you. They'd probably be scared to death to ask them to get a cup of coffee. I get coffee in my office all the time because it's just like, people are like, it's post-feminist, it's okay.
Right.
But so do you look at it as we've come a long way? Or do you look at it as a lot of things are persisting, to use a phrase, but in a different and maybe more, because it's quieter, more insidious way?
We've come a long way, but we haven't come far enough by a long shot. I talk at law schools and colleges, and I know from the experiences related to me, and also I I advise some young lawyers that a lot of what I experienced is still going on. I think it's in some ways more dangerous now because they said it to my face, which gave me an opportunity to retort. Whereas I think they believe it now, they just don't say it. No one would ask questions like, what kind of birth control do you use? Which were questions that my class was asked, because it's clearly illegal now. But that doesn't mean they aren't thinking it. When I was at Motorola, nobody ever mentions that I had a very good business corporate career after law. And I was doing international work for Motorola. And my boss said, well, you can't hire her. I know she wants to have a baby and she'll quit. And I just said to him, that's totally illegal, and I am hiring her. But I mean, he said it to me without thinking. And I know that there are plenty of other people who think the same thing, but they don't verbalize it, so you don't realize that you're being discriminated against. And what I experienced was more just gender discrimination. Harassment was in a very different place than it is now. And I think we're in again, post Harvey Weinstein, we're in a different place than we were, which who would have thought that Harvey Weinstein would start the Me Too movement? Who didn't think that it would be maybe Donald Trump with 18 complaints against him? Seriously. But it wasn't. It was Harvey Weinstein, but at least it started. So that's good.
I want to get to talk about Watergate, but before we do, I want to talk about a decision that you made that must not have been an easy decision, to write about some very personal issues in your book. And you could have chosen to not address them, but you talk about your marriage and you talk about
very interesting.
so what maybe, but that's a big leap of choosing to reveal a piece of yourself. Could you talk about that decision making and what I'm referring to?
Let me just say that most of my Watergate colleagues said, do not do this, including Lulu's father, who was very adamant that I should not do this.
Explain what this is.
This is that I had a very unhappy first marriage, which in some ways, let me just, the good parts, and I see Mike Berman here, who is part of the good part of my marriage, which was one weekend. But okay, so at least there was a good weekend. The reason I decided to reveal it is because I believe that I am not alone in this. Number one, I ended up with a good career because of it, because I wasn't happy at home. So if something needed to be done, I'll do it. I volunteered. I didn't mind staying late at the office because I didn't have the pull. If I was married to my current husband, I would have wanted to be at home with him. And so I worked extra hard, and it gave me a good career. It also, because in what you will view, I'm sure, as unfair and sexist, he came home while I was studying for the New York bar and said, I've decided that I want to work for the FCC, and we're moving to Washington. And I had already accepted a job, which would have been a disaster. I'd accepted at a firm on Wall Street, and instead I ended up being a criminal prosecutor that I loved. So it turned out, it ended up working out well, but I was, and it never occurred to me, this was in 1968, that I would stay in New York and do my job, and he would live in Washington, and we would commute. That was just not even a remote thought on my part, or any other woman's part at that time. And so I just felt like if other women will realize that it's not their fault, I blamed myself for the bad marriage. I also believed I had the power to fix it and the responsibility to fix it. And it took me 3 years with a therapist who is not so far from here on Connecticut Avenue to realize that it wasn't my fault that I had this terrible marriage, and that I had a right to be happy, and to finally confront him about certain things, and to find out the truth from him, and to leave him. And that's led to a happy life. At one point, the book was going to end we wanted to keep it close to Watergate because it was supposed to be focused on Watergate. And so it was going to be just like right after Watergate, I joined Fried Frank, and I was my office was at the Watergate office building. And I was really unhappy. I had just come off this unbelievable trial, and I was doing construction law. A building in Virginia had fallen down and killed 16 workers. And it just, and because I wasn't so engaged in my work, I had to realize that I had a bad marriage and didn't have a good home life. And so I really finally dealt with it, and that was where the book was going to end. And I thought, nobody wants me to be unhappy at the end. And I was writing the epilogue, and I said, if we go to the 15th page, just one more chapter, 15 pages, it ends with, I re-meet my high school boyfriend. I moved to Chicago. I'm starting a new life. I'm now married to him for 40 years, and it's all happy. So I thought that was a better ending than my crying in my office at the Watergate. So
one of the things that's striking, even though you started writing and working on this book in 2008, it has a particular resonance to read it in 2020, because one of the things that's really remarkable, and we've both talked about this on the air and in print, about the difference between Richard Nixon and Donald Trump, is that Donald Trump, in terms of responsiveness to congressional inquiries, really out-Nixoned Nixon. And you talk about how helpful it was for you and the Watergate Special Prosecution Force to be able to have access to White House logs of phone calls and other documentary information that allowed you to know which tapes you wanted to go after and subpoena. So would you talk a little bit about the comparison between those two presidencies and the two investigations?
And let me point out that I do not mention Trump until the epilogue. But I think when you're reading it, you will see phrases that you go, oh, that must be Trump saying it. But it's not. It's Nixon. Witch hunt and hoax. And if the president does it, it's not illegal. I mean, you will see, without my drawing your attention to it, the comparisons. And I think that Trump is way worse than Nixon was. Nixon actually did some good things. He passed Title IX. He opened China, the EPA. I mean, there were some good things. And he was able to govern in a way. I mean, I made this comment today on the Andrea Mitchell show. We were talking about the coronavirus. And the problem now is nobody believes Donald Trump. Whatever he says, we don't believe him because he has a history of lying. And we also don't think he can, even his supporters know he lies, and we need to be able to trust the government to manage what is a growing pandemic, and we don't. Whereas honestly, with Richard Nixon, I don't think we would have ever doubted that he would have hired the right people to do things. Now, he was immoral. I'm not, excusing his criminality, but I didn't have the same fear about governing in self-interest and not paying attention to the American public. So I think that's a pretty big difference. They both obviously had an immoral streak, and Richard Nixon lied. And in fact, in the roadmap that we were, unlike the Mueller team, we put together a roadmap and got permission from the courts to give it to the House Judiciary Committee as a map to impeachment. And they used it, very, very much relied on it. So we had done all that. And here you have just total suppression of the evidence. And the specific things that Ruth is talking about is one of the ways that we were able to subpoena tapes that met the standard of being able to show that it was a criminal conversation, not policy, not covered by executive privilege, was because we had phone logs and diaries. And we could say, we know that so-and-so met, and here's what happened right before that. And that's how we were able to establish the exact time. There is a sort of complicated part in the book where I talk about, at one point, Rosemary Woods says, well, I wasn't even sure that the Haldeman part that I accidentally erased was part of the subpoena, which it clearly was. But the original subpoena said 10:30 to 12, and the conversation was actually longer than that. It was 2 hours and 20 minutes. But we corrected it long before she was working on it because we got the phone logs. And so we were able to say it started at 11:45, went to 12:40. I mean, we had the specifics.
Because amazingly, the Nixon White House turned over that information
right.
that the Trump White House kind of gave the finger
Exactly.
to congressional investigators for. Besides yourself, probably the most fascinating character that you write about is Rosemary Woods, and the most fascinating episode is the 18.5-minute gap. Tell us a little bit about her, but tell us if you can. It is the enduring mystery of Watergate, right? But who is your suspect? What is the story that you sort of tell yourself in your mind about what you think happened there? Because it clearly is, and everybody in this room is, not everybody, but most of us are old enough to remember that amazing photograph. The reason we actually have that photograph, this is the best. I love this story. You were so smart. You're interrogating Rosemary Woods on the stand in the courtroom, and you're asking her to show and explain how it was that she could have accidentally erased this tape. And she says, well, I can't, it was easier in my office. And you say, well, fine, let's go to the office. And a White House photographer takes that famous picture of Rosemary Woods doing contortions to accidentally, air quotes, erase the tape.
I think the photograph, the old phrase was worth 1,000 words is a million words here. You cannot but look at that picture and her hanging onto her desk chair, white-knuckled, and she made it even worse. I mean, for anybody who doesn't know this story, and also there are great cartoons. Herb Block did some fabulous Rosemary Twist cartoons, but she said she had her left foot, which actually shortens your reach. I mean, if you have your right foot, you can stretch a lot further than if it's your left foot on the pedal. And she reached across an executive desk, this is not a small desk, to get the telephone. Now, when she first did it, we had brought the tape recorder we couldn't fit the typewriter on, but the tape recorder was on the ledge of the witness box. You know how small that is. And I asked her to go through the process. She put on the headphones, and then I asked the next question, and she lifted the headphone up and said, excuse me, what? So I said, well, okay, for the purposes of this, we're going to have to pretend you have them on, take them off. And she put them down next to the recorder. And in my next question, okay, so you push the button, do that. And she said, well, first I had to take off, and she gently pointed to the headphones. And with that small movement, her foot came off the pedal. And the jury box is next to the witness box. And because of the crowds, the clerk had allowed the press to sit in the jury box. And back then there were no cell phones, there was no electronic stuff. As soon as her foot came off the pedal, you could see the tape stop moving, and that jury box emptied in a flash because there was a bank of phones out in the hall, and they had to call in the story on a bank of payphones. And so a lot of this is lost to them, but it's captured in the record where she says, well, it was different in my office. I did it in my office. And I said, well, then maybe, Your Honor, we should adjourn to the office. And somehow we did. So it was my first time in the White House. My only time, adjacent to the Oval Office. And we had great pictures. In addition to the Rosemary stretch, we were also able to take pictures of where microphones were. And I have a picture of the Oval Office bathroom. It turns out there were no microphones in there for obvious reasons, but it was a really dinky, awful bathroom with linen towels, not even terry cloth towels, but anyway.
And so who done it?
Well, who done it? We'll never know. Rosemary Woods has passed on.
Will we never know?
Well, so far, we have tested every time new technology comes out, the experts try to bring back what was on the tape. We do know that it was Watergate because we have Haldeman's notes, and they stop exactly where the hum starts with Ely, Minnesota, and the next thing, Ely, Nevada, which is a place where Pat Nixon's parents were married. And that comes up in the conversation. You can hear it on the tape. And then there's the hum, and it says Watergate, PR offensive, and it goes into a few things. But they've even tested the notes to see if underneath on the page below that note that there's something that's missing, and that showed nothing. All the experts have found no way to reconstruct exactly what was there. In terms of who did it, there were only a few people who knew about the system at all. Rosemary Woods did not know until it was public that there was a taping system. Obviously, Alexander Butterfield, who revealed the system, knew about it and had helped install it. Secret Service agents who changed the tapes knew about it. And Haldeman, and eventually Alexander Haig, so by the relevant time. So the question is, we know from my questioning of her that Richard Nixon listened to a tape, to this tape, to the June 20th tape that was erased, when she was working on it for 29 hours at Camp David, and that he pressed buttons on it. So it's possible that he pressed something that caused part of this. Not likely, because the way she describes it, it was a sort of, probably not, but it could have been. And my theory is the first tape on our subpoena is this June 20th tape. So if you are the president and you're about to turn over tapes, you're going to want to listen to them first. And you're going to probably say, bring me tape 1. And you're going to listen to that. And you're listening, you go, oh man, that's incriminating. And he erases it. We also know from the experts that it's not one continuous erasure. It's 7 to 9 separate segments. And so you erase and you listen some more. Oh, that's bad too. Erase that. And did it 7 to 9 times. So it's not accidental. It was something that was done deliberately. It could have been when Rosemary Woods realizes her mistake. She waits for the president's red light to go off so that he's alone in the room, and she runs right in to tell him that she's made this terrible error. And he says, don't worry about it, it's not a subpoenaed tape. Now you know that he wouldn't know that unless he had already listened and had developed an excuse. And the next thing he does is he calls for Alexander Haig, and they go for a ride outside the White House around Washington. They get in the presidential limousine and drive around Washington. For what did they do that? What were they talking about? Were they saying, hey, Rose thinks she did it, let's let her take the blame? I think that may be possible, and that makes me very sympathetic toward Rosemary Woods. She was loyal to him. She started working for him when she met him when he was in the House of Representatives, and he hired her. His first hire was Rosemary Woods when he was elected to the Senate, and she stayed with him from then until after Watergate. And she did not go to California with him, although she did go into exile with him in New York after he lost the governorship, after he was, out of office. And she's the one who informed his family that he was resigning. He was afraid to tell them, and he asked her to do it. She had to tell Pat Nixon and Julie and Tricia. So, and she was, by the way, she was an advisor to him. She was not just someone who took dictation and typed up stuff. There's in the end of toward the end, I think it's in the main book, not in the appendix, in the epilogue, where there's conversations with her that you can see their relationship is not just as a boss and a secretary. It was, she was a true advisor to him. And so it's possible that she did it deliberately the way it looks, but I don't think so. I think her religion would have barred her from actually telling that blatant a lie. And so I think she actually thinks that she might have, and she never admitted 18 minutes. She said, I was only on the phone for 4 or 5 minutes. And so, and she said, I didn't listen to the whole hum before telling him, which to me was shocking. If I had made a mistake of that magnitude, I would not run into my boss without knowing the full magnitude of what I had done. And I would have listened to find out where it started again. But she swears that she only listened to the first few minutes, realized that there was a hum, and that she might have done it, and so she ran into the office. So I don't think she did it. I think it's much more likely that it was Nixon, probably, according to everybody. John Dean says he had trouble taking the top off a fountain pen. So it's unlikely that he had the skill to do it on his own. I feel bad about all you people back here. I have my back to you. Hi. I think he had to have had help. There's also a story in there. I hate to give away all the good parts, but the background to it is that I met Bob Woodward long after Watergate, and met with him, and I was trying to get some ideas from him, and he said, you know, there's one story that I never published because the source would not let me reveal it. He wouldn't go public. But you might want to talk to him, and here's his name and number. And so I called the source and realized that what he was saying was actually hearsay. He had heard from Steve Bull, who is the person who keyed up all of the tapes. I do not suspect him, but obviously he did have access. He could have done it. I mean, just in terms of who are the possible suspects. And so I called Steve, and I had an elaborate plan of questioning and getting his confidence before I asked the real question that I wanted to know. And although one of the questions that I did want to know was, he worked with her so closely, I wanted to know what he thought of her. Where did she shop? Where did, who were her friends? What did her apartment look like? And men basically don't notice that, except I now have found one who did as a result of being on Fresh Air. I got a phone call from her great nephew, who has now given me a lot of information about her apartment and her and some wonderful things. But anyway, I followed up on Bob's thing and found that Steve Bull, Alexander Haig was going around the White House asking for someone to take the blame for this was the original story from the source, was trying to find someone to take the blame for the 18-minute gap. And apparently asked Steve Bull, and Steve said, no way, I didn't have anything to do with it. And so that was sort of a new tidbit. Bob also told me to stop calling people to find out about Rose, because it's very easy to hang up on me, and people were hanging up on me. He said, you have to knock on their door. So I was staying with my friend Susan, who lives in Alexandria, and I walked over to the house of a woman who had worked for Rose in the White House, and I got the door slammed in my face. Yeah. So didn't work.
But things that work for Bob Woodward do not work for other people, as I have learned also, having had that same advice and similarly slammed doors. One of the actually most amazing Rosemary Wood factoids that everybody here will appreciate is that on her $36,000 a year White House salary, she was able to afford an apartment at the Watergate.
A duplex. I now know from her nephew.
So I want to get to questions before we run out of too much time. So come on up to the microphone.
Hi, thank you so much. Did you or anyone on the Good Guys team, I'm Carolyn Avery, nice to meet you, know who Deep Throat was before he came forward? Nobody knew. It was truly a secret?
We didn't. We analyzed every shred of information that Woodward and Bernstein said came from Deep Throat. And we would find, okay, we know 3 people who knew this fact. And then the next fact would be revealed, and it was a whole new set of people, no overlap. So we thought that there were probably multiple Deep Throats, that it was just a name for the source, not for a particular person. It, of course, in retrospect, makes great sense that the person seeing all the 302s, all the FBI reports, would have all of the information, even though only, person A reports fact 1. Well, Mark Felt knew that, and so it makes sense that it was him, but we did not suspect that.
You mentioned in the trial that Mardian, was told during the break not to blow up and so on. How are those defense attorneys allowed to coach him like that if he's still under cross-examination?
How what?
How are the defense attorneys allowed to coach him like that when he was still under cross-examination?
Well, that's actually a good question, but they did, and they did it right in front of me. The judge had left the room, but you're right, they shouldn't have been talking to him, but every single one of them was like, you can't behave this way. And they weren't telling him what to say. I mean, they weren't coaching his testimony, just his behavior. So it's probably okay. I think it probably fits the...
I have 2 quick questions.
Okay.
Number 1, do you think Ford should have pardoned Nixon, or should he have been prosecuted? And do you think Trump is the way, because the Republican Party learned their lesson through Watergate, and they have taught him not to turn over things?
I think Trump is who Trump is, regardless. But yes, I think they did learn from Watergate, so I think there is some truth to that. In terms of the pardon, that's a very controversial thing, and I I was on a panel with, I can't think of his name now, the lawyer who brought the pardon to San Clemente, to Nixon, with, what's his name? Benton Becker, yes, Benton Becker. And he really makes a very compelling and sad case for, yes, it was the right thing to do, and that in doing it, Nixon accepted guilt, because Benton Becker brought with a case and said to him, you must know that if you accept this pardon, you are admitting that you are guilty. You cannot accept a pardon unless you admit guilt. I think we would have been today in a better place. And let me preface this by saying there is nothing in the Constitution that I believe bars indicting a sitting president. I thought it then. We argued with, thank you. We had extensive arguments with Leon Jaworski about indicting him while he was a sitting president. And then we had arguments with him the day he resigned. We went to Leon and said, he's not a sitting president. Now we can do it. And there was a different set of arguments from Leon back to us about why we couldn't. And while we were having this dialogue, he got pardoned, and we researched the pardon and found that there is absolutely, once you're pardoned, there's nothing you can do. And would it be different if Trump could be indicted? Well, maybe, but would Barr ever allow that? The answer is clearly no. And Mueller clearly accepted the rule that you can't, so he didn't. And even though I believe the Mueller report made it clear that he expected impeachment to be the remedy, the Republicans made it clear that there is no impeachment remedy. So now we're left with you can't indict and you can't impeach. And there is still some hope. What about the states? What about some attorney general taking some action because they're not barred by the Office of Legal Counsel? And there is November, and so it's up to everyone in this room. It's up to you. Go campaign somewhere else. I mean, I'm not campaigning in Illinois. It doesn't matter because Illinois is blue. But Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all my neighboring states, that's where I'm putting my time in.
Hi, Jill.
Hi. Karen, wait, Karen's here. Karen was our court stenographer, Karen Scheinberg. Yay, Karen.
How are you? Oh my God, good to see you. Oh my God. Watergate was as important in my life as it was to you. I loved every minute of it, never, ever lost the sense that I was sitting right in the middle of history. I had 2 little kids. I ignored them completely.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I'm sure they grew up fine.
They did.
So
They did.
we've just been in touch recently because the foreman of the grand jury, Vladimir Pregel, passed away recently, and Karen got in touch with me to tell me about this service, and I tried to get here, but I failed. But anyway, it was, yes, we'll have to talk afterwards. So wonderful.
Hey, Joe, after this administration is gone, what do you think the likelihood is, yeah, hopefully, what do you think the likelihood is that there'll be some sort of independent task force to prosecute previous administration crimes, some sort of independent entity to clean up the mess that maybe we can't do politically?
It's sort of like the pardon question. You know, does the next administration want to keep looking back and do this? And my sense of moral outrage and justice says, yes, you should. It's the moral thing to do. My adult political self says, let's move on and get rid of this. And I think there are some crimes. I mean, you have Michael Cohen in jail who did something at the request of and for the benefit of individual number 1, who is Donald Trump. So how is it that he's in jail and Donald Trump is in the White House? I mean, I think there's some unfairness. We worried, by the way, during Watergate that by not indicting the president, that there would be jury nullification and that they would acquit the defendants with overwhelming evidence, clear evidence. But they would say, you know, the man in charge, he's not here. Why should these people go to jail? Obviously, that didn't happen, but it could have. And the same thing's true here, although so far people are getting convicted, so. Yes.
Hi. A question I have is, how much technical knowledge did you have to have of the tape recorder and the tapes in order to question Woods?
That's a great question. And when I went to the White House, Carl Feldbaum, who is not here, but who I was emailing with today, Carl Feldbaum, who was not on our trial team, but was part of the Watergate prosecution. We were divided into different task forces. And he came with because he had a science bachelor's degree. Now, it was in biology, but he was the closest thing we had to a technical person. And so he came with me to the White House. I don't know how helpful it was. I got advice. Obviously, we had expert witnesses, and we talked to experts, and I got advice. I got letters from hundreds of secretaries across the country telling me about how it could have been done, how it couldn't have been done, that it didn't happen the way she said. And, you know, we relied on technical experts that we interviewed. And so it's, you know, if you're a trial lawyer, you have to become an instant expert. I learned cement construction when I was at Fried Frank because that was my first case, and I had to know everything there was about cement construction. I don't remember a thing about it, so you can't ask me now. But, you know, for a moment, I knew everything you needed to know about cement construction.
Thank you.
And we have time for this one last question.
Okay.
I was one of those people who spent the night before the case of United States versus Nixon was argued on the plaza of the Supreme Court and slept there. It was an incredibly dramatic day, and the consensus among the people who I sat with during the arguments was that Mr. Jaworski kind of fumbled the argument, but Mr. Lacovara knocked it out of the park.
Yeah.
What do you remember about that day?
Well, I think I have a very sensitive portrayal in the book of the aftermath of the argument and Leon's reaction to it. He was extremely distraught because he got some criticism in the press, a lot of criticism. And Phil Lacovara, who is a brilliant lawyer and had been in the Solicitor General's office and experience, you know, there's a difference between Leon's experience as a trial lawyer, which is a very different skill set than an oral argument at the Supreme Court. And Leon shines in trials, but Phil really was expert at the oral argument and did a brilliant job. And he had done the brief with many other people helping, but Phil Lacovara was terrific. So, and Leon was upset about it. You'll have to read that because I can't really quite capture that. And I tried to comfort Leon and point out all the praise that he got. And not dissimilar to me, if one bad thing is said and 100 good things are said, the one I focus on is the one criticism. And so I really understand him. And I understand that part of him anyway. And so I did try to comfort him.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for great questions. Thank you, Jill. Thank you for asking me to do this. And there are lots of other incredibly juicy bits in Jill's book, so you should buy it and read it and enjoy it.
And I just want to thank all of you for coming out, especially with coronavirus fears. And I want to thank Ruth, who is one of the people I admire the most. I'm so honored that she would take the time to do this. So thank you.
Okay.